Are you a competitor? Are you an ally? Are you a threat? How would you regard your relationship with Britain?
First of all, between China and Britain, from the Chinese perspective, Britain is not a rival, is not a competitor, it is not an enemy, is not an adversary. Britain is just an important country to get along with in peace and in friendship. But I think it would be completely misguided for Britain to view China as an enemy or adversary or a competitor. What do China and Britain compete with? China is the largest manufacturer of automobiles. Competing with Britain? No. China is the largest exporter of EV cars and will lead the whole world in EV production. Is Britain a competitor? No. China will be the biggest and most important producer and R&D in terms of semiconductor in no time. Does that mean that China competes with Britain? No. China will be the leading nation in AI revolution. China is a fact. China is a megatrend for Britain to live with.
And how are you holding up under all this pressure? Are you getting time to do some thinking? Are you getting enough sleep at night? Again, I've been there, and it is so very, very hard. And your many fans, and I am one of them, we do have worries.
Good to see you. Thank you so much.
How are you? Thank you for this meeting, team, and of course, we're very happy that today will resume our diplomatic relations.
نشعر بالقسوة الحرب المكافئة.
Syrian Arab Republic.
Russian President Vladimir Putin said on Monday that he was ready to extend the New START arms control treaty with the U.S. by 1 year, an agreement that limits how many nuclear weapons each side can have.
After February 5th, 2026, Russia is prepared to continue adhering to the central quantitative limits of the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty for 1 year. Going forward, based on an analysis of the situation, we will make a decision if we continue adhering to these voluntary self-limitations. We believe this measure will only be viable if the United States acts in a similar manner.
The president is aware of this offer extended by President Putin, and I'll let him comment on it later. I think it sounds pretty good, but he wants to make some comments on that himself, and I will let him do that.
The offer comes as Ukraine tries to convince Trump to impose harsher sanctions on Russia, something that Putin made public at a meeting of the Security Council. Russia and the United States have by far the biggest nuclear arsenals in the world, and many experts fear that ending the limits could fuel an arms race.
Welcome. It is Thursday, September 25th, I think it is. Welcome to the Whiners, episode 53. I'm your host, your only host tonight, actually, because I ran a coup. No, actually, Jeff Norman is in Connecticut visiting family and going to a concert, and Morgan, she is on special political assignments. So all you have tonight is just the very bald me. So, and welcome, Harley, to our audience.
Hello, Ryan. Good to see you.
Good. Let me say a little bit about you, and then we'll get on. Actually, the last time I think I saw you was at an event in New York with Diane Sayers, Scott Ritter, Colonel Larry Wilkerson, Garland Nixon in 2024. So last year, almost a year. I'm trying to remember exactly.
It was November.
Was it November?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Yeah, that's right. And so now, before we get into everything, I just want to tell people I'm going to be drinking some wine tonight. I have a very nice Pinot Noir. And this is from California, and it's got, I don't know, it's got a little bit of a dry and interesting flavor. It's out of the price range of Jeff. That's why I told him not to be here. I didn't want him to hear the screams of a higher priced wine. It's not from Trader Joe's, which is his favorite. But in any case, Harley, I won't make you drink wine because you're in Germany and it's way past your bedtime.
Ordinarily, I'd love to join you. We have some good wine in Germany.
Yeah, I like the white wines. The red wines tend to be a little bit lighter for me, though.
Yeah, the Spätburgunden.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, I like the Trocken wines, but that's about as dark as they get, and they don't get as dark as the ones California or France. So just by way of introduction, Harley is a journalist living in Germany. He's the spokesman for the Schiller Institute. He is also now the president of the LaRouche organization. You give daily reports on YouTube, I believe. And actually, I will post at some point here your YouTube channel. But you give daily reports there. The thing that's interesting is that the work with the Schiller Institute, the purpose, correct me if I'm wrong, Harley, is that the United States, together with other industrial nations, will act to overcome the underdevelopment and poverty of the so-called developing sector. I think we now call it the global South, maybe, right. With the aid of advanced technologies, right? I get that right?
Hopefully with good sense, because we're going into some tough, very turbulent times in the West. The global South is now asserting their right to sovereignty, and the old colonial order is gone. So either we move in the right direction, and Putin and Xi and others have said the United States could become a part of this. So hopefully that's what we're looking for.
Well, definitely, I want to talk about that. Now, you just came out with a new article, which resonated very much with some of my thinking. The assassination of Charlie Kirk and the strategy of tension. And I have to say, I do not want to talk about, was there a laser? Did the bullet miraculously stop under? I'm not interested in talking about that. I have rifles on my back wall. I can talk about shooting all the time. I don't want to talk about that. But you said a few things in the article that definitely have, the theme maybe for tonight. You said that the assassination has to be seen in a larger process to provoke these deep counter reactions and further entrench the left-right profile within the American population.
Yeah, that's right. And that's the idea of the strategy of tension. Initially came out of Italy, where you had the Red Brigades and you had the old Mussolini right-wing networks. But pulling the strings over the top was something called Operation Gladio, which was a NATO, basically an international assassination bureau. And the purpose was to keep the countries of Europe in the European Union, in NATO, and basically on the strategy of the City of London. And this goes back to the end of World War II, Churchill's idea that you should have a divided world between two empires. He would have liked to overthrow the Soviet Empire, but Britain at that point, it was too weak economically and militarily. So with NATO, they came up with the idea of keep the United States in, keep Russia out, and keep Germany down. And I have to say, that's still what NATO is doing today. And the strategy of tension is designed to do two things. On the simple level, to provoke fear in the population so that they'll be willing to accept a police state, a national security state, surveillance, and so on. And 9/11 is an example of that. Once it happened, instead of really figuring it out who did it and why, what we were forced into was what Snowden exposed, the complete top-down surveillance. Mm-hmm. That's only part of it. It's also to keep people's eyes off the bigger picture. And the bigger picture right now is that there's a new economic order coming into existence, which is not necessarily anti-dollar and anti-West, but it's anti-speculation. It's in favor of sovereign nation states working for mutual benefit rather than surrendering to a globalist banking system.
Now, hold that thought a second. I want to go back to the original strategy of tension, what you were just touching on Gladio, because I think it will help us to fill out what's going on right now. I was refreshing my own thinking about that. And in that period of time, what was it, 68 roughly to about 78 or maybe 1980? It's hard to say exactly for me. Yeah. But you also had multiple assassinations in the United States. It was kind of off the tail end of the assassination of Kennedy, King, but then there were others, right, that went into that.
Kennedy, yeah.
Bobby Kennedy, and Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and then you had the dictatorship of Pinochet in South America. But what I was sort of surprised about, you had in Spain, Greece, Portugal, maybe some other European countries. You had some other dictatorships.
And Germany, well, not dictatorship, but Germany, you had assassinations of key figures who were part of the financial community that were not willing to go along with what eventually became the European Union.
Okay. So the thing that was interesting to me in your article, you said that the strategy of tension was defined as political policy that encourages violent struggle to create this climate of fear and insecurity, and it leads the public to seek security in a strong national security state. So you said, like 9/11, but I also read elsewhere that there was something about the fear of the Soviets marching across Europe, that was part of what the matrix was, or propaganda maybe back then.
Well, what you had was an effort by some countries to have détente or a rapprochement or a normalization of relations with the Soviet Union. Because otherwise, what you had, for example, in Germany, was you had the SS-20 missiles from the Soviet Union, and you had U.S. Nuclear missiles put in Germany. So you had an incredible real tension, possible nuclear confrontation. Mm-hmm. And in order
the Cuban Missile Crisis also was around that time.
Well, the Cuban Missile Crisis was 62.
Earlier. 62, yeah.
But there was an effort after that from the United States, from John Kennedy, for rapprochement with the Soviet Union. He had an ongoing back-channel dialogue with Khrushchev, which ended up with the Test Ban Treaty. But the militarists, the military-industrial complex, didn't like it. And Kennedy was also a victim of the same, I would say, International Assassination Bureau. Now, in terms of Italy, the specific thing there is Aldo Moro, when he was prime minister, was trying to arrange to bring the Communist Party into some form of relationship to the government. The Communist Party had about 25 to 28% of the vote. It was not insubstantial. And there had been an effort to keep them down. And what Moro said is we should have an opening to the Soviet Union, which would benefit the Italian economy. And so it was called the Historic Compromise, bring the Communist Party out into the open. And it was not a pro-communist movement, it was a pro-peace movement. At the same time, you had that with Helmut Schmidt in Germany, the Schmidt-Brezhnev deal, which was also 1978. So what happens in Italy? Moro gets kidnapped by supposedly a left-wing group, the Red Brigades. He's held for 50-some days. He was the party leader of the Christian Democrats. He wasn't the prime minister at that time. And then they find his body eventually. And in the meantime, one of the things that happened is the Italian government ended the relationship between the finance ministry and the central bank. In other words, they had the central bank freed like the Federal Reserve, supposedly independent and outside of any government monitoring or control, which was exactly what the intent was of the City of London. And what Moro and his centrist movement was trying to stop. They wanted to keep some form of control over the bankers. So the parallel here, the other thing with Kennedy, and this is important, Ryan, people don't know this. June 63, Kennedy did two things. One was his peace speech at American University, where he spoke about détente with the Soviet Union. The other was in June of 63, an executive order issuing U.S. Treasury notes to replace Federal Reserve notes as an experiment. How do you get the economy moving again? And the central bank, working on behalf of the private banks, was restricting credit. So Kennedy said, well, under our constitutional system, it's the Congress and the presidency which can create credit. And so he moved to do that. And I think that plus the moves toward rapprochement with the Soviet Union were the initiating reasons for killing Kennedy.
Yeah, that's very interesting because when again, going back to the Charlie Kirk thing, I certainly pick up some of these tensions, that you're talking about in the article. And I think people get very myopic, right? They reduce everything to the smallest possible thing that they think they can handle, and they don't like to see the bigger picture. I was reading.
That's exactly right.
This article, this was a poll in USA Today. It finds that Republicans and Democrats think that the U.S. is in a political crisis following the Charlie Kirk assassination. 93% of Democrats, 84% of independents, and 60% of Republicans say the U.S. is in a political crisis. And more than half of voters are pessimistic about freedom of speech being protected in the United States.
Well, as you know, we're seeing an attempt to clamp down on freedom of speech. And what Bondi, the Attorney General, said, well, we have to stop hate speech. Well, what is hate speech? For example, if you are critical of what Israel is doing in Gaza, you're called anti-Semitic. It has nothing to do with the Jewish people. It has to do with the policy of the state of Israel. But if you're not allowed to express that, and people are put in jail in England over that. In Germany, there's a tremendous crackdown now. The European Union has an extremely tough censorship provision in collaboration with Google and the so-called Alphabet. But the same thing's coming here to the United States. So there is a move to crack down. And again, why are they saying it? Well, because they want to limit what people look at as alternatives and keep people within a narrow band, as you point out, of comfort. And if you step out of that narrow band, you get slapped down. In Germany, they can seize your bank account.
Okay, so now jumping to the present, right? So in terms of the overwhelming amount of news, right? Fake Russian drone attack on Polish territory, and you have all of these NATO and EU heads saber rattling over that. you have, of course, Charlie Kirk. A couple of days ago, or now I forget now if it's 2 days ago or yesterday, you had a semi-copycat in Dallas shooting ICE agents. The Israeli attack on Qatar. Of course, in Germany, right, we had the 16 different political figures who were killed. 7 of them were from the AfD. So to me, so there's that, and then the whole debate and battle over Gaza at the UN. It seems like anything that's substantial, that or at the beginning of September, August and September, was the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which I thought was actually a positive development, where, you know, off of the heels of Trump meeting with Putin in Alaska, which I think is a Trump good intention, right? There was just a phone call between Trump and Xi of China. So you see things like this Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and I think, well, man, what if Trump were at something like that, where they're discussing how to reorganize the relations between nations? So that almost
that's not so far-fetched, because Trump very often will talk about problems he has with the Federal Reserve. And the underlying issue of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is how institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Economic Forum control credit. And they control credit in a way that doesn't allow sovereign nations to actually engage in expanded trade. And so you have this effort underway to move toward trade in national currencies. Now, some people tell Trump that's an attack on the dollar. It's not an attack on the dollar. The dollar's under attack because of our own banking system. So the question is, how do you increase trade and make it fair? And that's what the fight is about with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the BRICS. Lyndon LaRouche put forward the idea for the BRICS before anyone. At the time in 1997, he talked about Russia, India, China, and the United States reorganizing the banking system. And again, after the 2007-2008 crash, he said the same thing. And, you know, the 2007-2008 crash is an interesting example of how this works, the left-right paradox. Because you had on the one side Occupy Wall Street, and on the other side the Tea Party. Now, both of those groups, the Occupy was supposedly left-wing, the Tea Party right-wing, but what did they have in common? They opposed the bailout of the banks. The banks were the too big to fail banks got over $20 trillion in bailout funds, whereas 7 million families lost their homes. And they also both disagreed with Obamacare. You could have had an alliance between the two, except instead they started pointing at each other, calling the so-called conservatives fascists and the Occupy people socialists. And it ended up with what? A bailout and a financial system which is extremely weak, with more power to the big banks. And so that's how the strategy of tension works.
You know, again, this is very interesting, because now what you have is in MAGA. I mean, I'm fascinated by Marjorie Taylor Greene coming out, and she's saying the genocide word when it comes to Gaza. Matt, I forget his name suddenly.
Gates.
Matt Gaetz, right. He is also Owen Schroyer, who just left Alex Jones, InfoWars, although Alex Jones has come out and he said that Trump's gone off of his rocker with his recent statement with regards to Russia and Ukraine. So, but you do have there in the MAGA and MAHA coalition, some people are just saying, hey, things are not what we voted for. We're not getting where we're supposed to be going.
Well, let's take, just on that point, take a look at what Charlie Kirk was saying. That what's coming out from Tucker, from Candace Owens and others, is that, well, Kirk was still committed to defense of Israel. He wasn't accepting the idea that it's okay to kill babies to revenge the Hamas attacks on October 7th. He questioned that. He went to Trump and he questioned the idea of an attack on Iran. What does this have to do with making America great? Now, that was enough to convince some people that he had to go. And we hear the stories of the leading Zionist contributors in the donor class upset when Charlie Kirk brought Tucker Carlson to speak at one of his events, the TPUSA event.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what I admire about Charlie Kirk was he was willing to have open and free debate. I don't agree with him on every issue. And in fact, a lot of them I disagree with. But his idea was that in a country like the United States, you have to have the freedom to explore different ideas. You can't silence people. And when he started questioning the whole role of Trump's support for Israel, he saw something interesting. The young people that were coming around him in the 3,000 or so chapters, they're mostly Republicans, but the 18 to 30-year-old Republicans, by over 70%, oppose what Netanyahu's doing. And that's the kind of thing that Charlie would see. And it would cause him to think about it. So he became expendable for the people who had funded him, because a lot of his money came from these Zionists who wanted to recruit young people to the Republican Party as allies of Israel. And that's an important aspect here also.
So on this, because it is some people have said it is a free speech question, right? We saw the Biden administration cracking down on people with free speech. So is this a case? See, this is where I have some trouble with this, because like you said, what Pam Bondi was doing, some people want to say that Stephen Colbert being dumped, Jimmy Kimmel being dumped, although it's kind of interesting, he has been brought back, was all an anti-free speech thing. YouTube claims that they were under pressure, and they're saying we're going to bring back channels, but there's kind of an asterisk, because maybe there's something with Netanyahu involved in that. To me, it seems like if you take that clamping down on free speech thing, but then you look at what Tulsi Gabbard is doing, where she's cleaning house with a lot of the people that you might call the deep state people. It seems like there's a conflict even inside the Trump administration.
Well, there is a conflict inside the Trump administration. And Tulsi Gabbard, in my opinion, is one of the real heroes in this fight, because she went in. Remember, she was a Democrat. She was on the high-level Democratic National Committee representative who watched what was done in the 2016 campaign in violation of the party rules to deny Bernie Sanders delegates. She was watching what Hillary was doing, the unfolding of Russiagate, the complete fraudulent narrative that Putin was manipulating the US election and so on. And this, in spite of the fact that it was completely exposed as nothing, as a bunch of lies, you still have people like Adam Schiff and Rachel Maddow. That's all they'll talk about. Putin, Putin, Putin. Your dog's pregnant, blame Putin. This is the mentality that Tulsi's taking on. Now, the problem is that you have a number of people that are Trump supporters. Someone like Lindsey Graham, for example, who's on and off with Trump. But the old rhinos, the people he defeated in 2016, the Bush Republicans, they're still there. They have a very prominent place in the Republican Party. And they're using their leverage over the Christian Zionists to keep Trump on the side of Netanyahu. And so I think there are things that Trump is trying to do. Now, the Ukraine situation that just came up, I have a slightly different interpretation than the mainstream media. What Trump basically said is, I'm washing my hands of it. It's up to Europe now. You guys take care of it. You want to fight Russia? Go ahead. Because he knows that they can't do it. And the Europeans initially were saying, oh, this is great. Trump is now going to support our war against Russia. And then they started thinking, well, if we don't have a U.S. backup, how is this going to work?
That's
Yeah.
actually the title of the London Telegraph,
Yeah.
which I was sort of surprised. I don't get that at all, how it's Trump saying, I'm washing my hands, because Zelensky said, well, now the United States is going to sell weapons to Europe. And he said, do whatever you want to do. And then he says, well, everybody in Moscow better find a bomb shelter because we're going to send them all the way to Moscow.
Well, he makes a lot of different threats. But I think,
cocaine laced threat. Maybe he's on Tylenol. Maybe he's taking Tylenol.
yeah, I don't know. But I'll tell you what will happen. The Russians and the U.S. are talking about these things. And when Trump said that Russia is a paper tiger, Lavrov, the foreign minister, said, no, we're a bear, and there's no such thing as a paper bear. But what's going to determine the situation in Ukraine is the fighting on the ground. And Ukraine can't put together an army. The Europeans can't put together enough money. Look, the reason the Alternative for Deutschland is now the leading party in the polls in Germany is the Germans don't like the idea of Chancellor Merz saying that we're going to provide long-range weapons to Ukraine. Macron in France is 20% in the polls. He's just had another government lost. So these governments in Europe are highly unpopular. Trump knows that.
Mm-hmm.
And so to say to the Europeans, you go ahead, you take over, do what you want to do, I'll take care of Putin. How often has he said he's going to increase the sanctions on Russia and not done it? I think there's a long-term perspective that Trump has, that he sees normalization of relations with Russia as more important than the so-called freedom and democracy of Ukraine, which is a fraud in the first place. And so what he's basically looking at is how do we achieve the goals we have in relations with Russia? And it just came out yesterday, the restoring of the arms control negotiations. They want to bring back the intermediate range missile agreement. And both the Russians...
The New START you're talking about, New START?
Yeah. And both the Russians and the U.S. want that. Now, who doesn't want that? The arms manufacturers, the financial cartels, the idiots running the mainstream media. So the question is, will these things come out into the open and be discussed or not? And that's where the strategy of tension comes in. If you keep people thinking that we're about to have a nuclear war with Russia or Iran or communists in your neighborhood are going to come slit your throat at night, or right-wing fascists are going to blow up your synagogue, if you have that in your mind, you don't think about broader strategic issues. And that's how the thing works.
Okay, that's fascinating. I actually have a question from our live chat for you on Europe. This is from our friend Vedran Sladoja. He lives in Austria. He says, Harley, what do you think of the general uprising of nationalist movements all across the EU? Any indication that they would become brown, I guess he means like brown shirt movements, and probably, I'm thinking of the demonstrations in The Hague and Netherlands and the UK. Maybe that's what he's also talking about. What do you say to that?
Well, in Germany, the Alternative for Deutschland has been labeled a Nazi party. Now, what's the policy of the Alternative for Deutschland? It's stopping the war in Ukraine. It's restoring German-Russian trade relations. That's hardly fascist. The Merz government and the previous government of Scholz providing weapons to the neo-Nazi militias in Ukraine, why are those not called Nazi? Now, Austria is an interesting case because you had a government with what's called the FPÖ, the equivalent of the Alternative for Deutschland. They tried to form a government and the European Union sabotaged it. You had a nationalist run first in the Romanian election, and they canceled the election. You now have Marine Le Pen not allowed to run in France. So the so-called democracy movement in the European Union, if you don't elect who they want, they shut down the election. So that's where, and silence the debate. Now, I would say the sovereignty movement in Europe, and it's not all the same, because there are some hardcore right-wingers in the AfD, but there are also some very reasonable people who I know and work with, more reasonable than people who are supporting Merz, who basically comes out of BlackRock. So, the question, and in Austria is a perfect example of this. They won't allow a center-right government to come in Austria. So the people don't like these existing governments. The Macrons and the Merz and the Starmers, they hate them. And the question then is, what's the alternative? And that's where what we're trying to do is to put together a leadership in the West that can get above party, can get above private personal gain, and look at what's necessary for the future. And that's always been the approach of LaRouche. Don't go along with something that's simple and pragmatic when you need something that's much bigger. And LaRouche was talking about reforming the financial system going back to 1975.
Yeah, actually, let me say something about that. I was looking at all of the economic statistics. So there's a few accounts that I follow, and we've actually had some guests on our show who are watching the economic things. But let me throw a few things at you in the context of where you're headed. In 2025, there's been over 806,000 job cuts in the U.S. So we've already passed 2024, which was 761,000. And then the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they always do these revisions. So about 900,000 jobs were erased in their revisions. Entry-level corporate hiring is down. There were 38,000 H-1B approvals from the top 11 biggest companies, like, for example, and this is just 2025. Amazon, 10,000 H-1B, JP Morgan Chase, 2,000, Microsoft, 5,000, Apple, 4,000. Citigroup cut 3,500 jobs in their tech operations in China so that they could move them to India. Those jobs in China were costing them $18,000 per engineer. Now they want to go to half of that. And of course, Americans, they want to be paid $120,000 a year to work in these jobs. Consumer debt, 18 trillion, mortgage debt, 12 trillion, student loan, 1.6 trillion. Unrealized losses on investment securities for U.S. banks reached almost 400 billion in the second quarter of this year, 6 times higher than that 2008 financial crisis that you were just talking about. And then you go to Germany, 125,000 layoffs in industrial jobs in 6 weeks. Volkswagen led it with 35,000, Mercedes, 40,000, ThyssenKrupp, heavy industry, 11,000. That's 40% of their entire workforce.
Well, and when you talk about the auto sector in Germany, that's the driver of the German economy, which is the driver of the European Union economy. And it's a combination of green policy, high energy prices because of the cutoff of gas and oil from Russia. And on top of that, it's the lack of credit. And the credit that's available, where's it going? To the military. The European Union voted up $1 trillion or €1 trillion, which is about $1.2 trillion in bonds to buy weapons. Now, they don't have that. The Germans can't produce the weapons. Rheinmetall, which is the leading metal military producer in Germany, they have to buy weapons from the United States. So, and they're not going to be able to continue to finance these movements because of into the military because of inflation. And let me add one other point. The Bundeswehr, the German army, is trying to recruit to grow because every month they have more people leave than they can recruit. They go to the high school campuses, the graduations, to try and recruit young people. And the only way they get interest is when they bring drones and video games. Then when they say, okay, will you sign up? The people say, hell no, I don't want to fight a war against Russia. So Europe is a mess. It's a total mess. Trump is right about Europe. But the United States isn't, as you pointed out just now, Ryan, that was very useful, because the 37 trillion debt, national debt, is going to keep growing, because every year there's $1 trillion in debt service that's added on. And if you just print money to try to ensure there's liquidity, there's a difference between solvency and liquidity. If a company's not solvent, you can give them liquidity, but all you're doing is increasing the debt down the road. It's like paying for a mortgage on a credit card. That's the U.S. economy right now. And what we saw in 2008, we're going to see something bigger this time because of the exposure of the derivatives markets. So that's what they're trying to silence discussion of.
Okay, so the modern strategy of tension is don't talk about the elephant in the middle of the room.
Yeah, right.
So go ahead.
Don't worry about it. We'll take care of it by printing money. And then you see the tensions that comes up around something like the Federal Reserve. The problem with the Federal Reserve System is it's there not for the American people. It's not a constitutional institution in the sense of the founding fathers and the Hamiltonian credit system that built the country. It's owned, the Federal Reserve is owned by the private banks. And that's one of the big problems. So the president may want to fire this Federal Reserve governor or that one, but it's the system. The system has been unconstitutional since 1913, but it's getting worse because of the hollowing out of the physical economy of the United States. And instead we have billionaires in speculative areas, trading systems and so on.
So I would like to get at what the solution would be, at least as we see things shaping. Again, going back to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, I was reading that President Xi, I think he referred to Putin as like my old friend in his introduction of him. And I think about when I have been to places like in Russia, you have, well, I was there, for example, for the 80th anniversary of the victory, World War II. And really across the population, you have a sense, not I'm Christian, I'm not Muslim, I'm not left, I'm not right. They're pretty much everybody was in celebration of being Russian, right? I do pick this up when I talk to people in China as well, because you have, the fact is that they have lifted everybody out of the worst poverty levels, right? And there's just this perspective to growth, like we had in the introduction. They're just going to win at everything. And in fact, there was an article in Bloomberg recently in the last couple of days where a group of venture capitalists from the United States did a road trip in China. And I think it was 8 venture capitalists from Western firms who shared their experience, and they were looking at the question of where to invest their money. And I'm not really talking about the money side of things, but the thing that they found that was interesting is that after visiting China firsthand, they saw China's dominance in all these different layers in the economy, and everybody was sort of on the same page across the board that they spoke with. Now, we don't have that. We, in terms of the American population, how do you take Trump's better inclination to say, I want to work with Russia, I want to work with China, I do want to make America better, and how do you get the population on the same page, right, so we can participate in these kinds of things?
Well, I think most Americans are looking for solutions. What I would say is the American people know what they don't want. but they don't know what they need. And this goes back to the fight. Look, the speculative system went out of control with the repeal of Glass-Steagall. And that was something that took 20 years from Greenspan and Volcker in the 1980s up through the 1999 bill that Clinton signed. Once Glass-Steagall was taken out, the banks were deregulated, which meant that the banks that had access to credit could take over everything else. And so who did that? Well, it was Chase Manhattan, it was Wells Fargo, it was Bank of America, and they had the control of the Federal Reserve System. Now, they're not interested in whether a farm in Iowa is profitable or whether a small business in New Mexico is profitable. They're interested in international trading. And more importantly, how can they use the leverage of the dollar to make money without producing anything? Now, that's what the BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization are starting to change. They're saying if we don't have to switch our currency to dollars in order to trade so that we pay for things in dollars, that cuts our costs. So we want to use our national currency. Now, here's where the other thing comes in. Many of these national currencies are backed by gold or they're backed by production. Our economy is not backed by anything but this belief in the Ponzi schemes that have been hatched by Wall Street and the City of London. And ultimately, what's backing the dollar these days? Nothing. And so if you think about the creation of money to pay debt, creating more debt, and not producing the real goods and products that add value to the economy, how do you ever retire the debt? So we're facing an extreme debt problem, as is most of the rest of the West. And what you've got to do is use bankruptcy reorganization with the banks. And then you look at a corporation, and bankruptcy is a means by which you determine whether it's worth putting more money into it or not. But we don't do that anymore. We bail them out because if we don't, you start a run on the bank. And this is what happened in 2020 with the repo crisis. The banks couldn't come up with enough money to pay off the overnight debt, the 24-hour credit crunch. Mm-hmm. And so the Fed had to come in and produce another, I think it was 20 trillion over the 2019 to 2022 period. So, you need a reorganization. Now, that's where leadership comes in. And if Trump really wants to make this country great again, he's going to have to go after the Federal Reserve and go after this problem of confusing liquidity with solvency. And that's really, I think, as a businessman, maybe he can do it, but it's going to require the American people making demands on it, and including on the idiots and the bought-off prostitutes in the Congress, who they're interested in becoming millionaires. They're not. Yeah.
They're pathetic.
Yeah.
Speaking of the debt, apparently one of the ideas that's being floated in the United States is to use the crypto economy to offload all of that debt, where the U.S. would try to basically, I don't know exactly, to reshape the gold and crypto markets to counter the declining trust in the dollar, and sort of like what was done in the 30s and the 70s, solve the problem at the world's expense. And can you say anything about that, Harley, in this context? Is that the same thing as a reorganization?
No, because the crypto is, if it's about money, the problem is monetarism, the idea that an economy is about money. I mean, what LaRouche always used to say is money is stupid. What's smart is how you use credit, because credit is where you get the free energy to produce enough so that you can cover your existing costs, but also borrow from the future with the idea that you're going to increase the productivity of labor and the productivity of your factories and your farms, and then you can pay off the debt. That's the better part of the American system was based on that. Now, crypto is just another speculative system. Now, there is a possible use for blockchain from the original idea from the founder of it, Satoshi, whose essential idea was that you can track without a top-down control. You have a ledger that's clear, so that it prevents money laundering. It prevents drug money coming in and buying up corporations. And this is something the digital yuan. The Chinese are looking into this. The Russians are looking into it. We're looking into crypto as a speculative device that can make some people rich, and offloading some of the debt, so that ultimately it comes back to the banks. And under the Dodd-Frank bill from 2010, 2011, gives the banks the right to seize your deposits. And they're thinking about the bank's deposits as the backup for the stable coin system. So they'll produce some of these currencies that will be in the hands of the biggest speculators and give them a demand on the deposits in the banking system. That's not going to solve anything. So, I'm looking into this whole question. There's some people I know who are in finance who are studying what the Chinese are doing with the digital currency for trade balances and so on. So, there's no magic bullet. There's real production. If you don't have an economy oriented toward physical goods production, then you have to borrow from someone else. You steal from someone else. That's why the global South is reacting against the monetary system, because they've been subsidizing the comfort levels of the West by letting their raw materials go cheaply, their labor cheaply, and so on. Now they're saying no more. And China did that. And we say, well, China did it unfairly. No, they did it the way we used to do it, by building a middle class.
So, it seems to me Europe is really desperate, and that's partly why the drive for war. And the U.S. is also going to just take from or make Europe a client colony, in a sense, for our own financial system.
Well, that's what the tariff policy is. What Trump is saying is we're going to get money from all these other countries to bail us out. And it's going to weaken the other countries so that at a certain point we'll lose whatever benefit we have from that.
All right. Well, and China says we have 150 countries that we're trading with. We don't even need to participate in the West, although they don't seem to be hostile to working with us. So that's sort of the trick. How do we get Trump to work with Russia on a New START treaty, work with Russia, China, and these other countries around economic development? And I guess a lot of what Trump says we just have to ignore. Is that a safe thing to say, Harley?
Well, I talk about the problems of Trumpology. Okay. If you're trying to figure out why he's doing things, there's no basis for figuring it out. He wakes up in the morning and has one idea, and by noon he's got 3 other ideas, and then he talks to someone else and gets another idea. There's some people you shouldn't listen to, like Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary. He comes from Soros. It's so ironic to me that why Trump would listen to a Soros guy. Or his praise for King Charles. King Charles is the leading promoter of green transition. And Trump just spent most of his UN speech properly trashing the green policy.
I was going to play parts of that. It was very long, but I thought most of what he said there was actually very sane in this regard.
Well, on the green technology, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, the problem is not Trump. The problem is the American people. And the American people voted for Trump because he said he was going to clean out the deep state. He's got to do that now, follow it through. There's talk about maybe an indictment of Comey. Well, how about Brennan? How about the whole Obama team that was involved in this? How about people like Blinken? who essentially got us into the Ukraine war because they wouldn't talk to Russia. Trump is right. Had he been president, there wouldn't have been a Ukraine war because he and Putin would have talked about it. So, you know, there's no simple solution, but we have to become a functioning republic again, where the individual citizen takes responsibility. That's the whole discussion of the founding fathers. And here we are, we're coming up on the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Mm-hmm. Why don't we read it? Why don't we discuss it? Think about it. How does our system work? And it's the emphasis is on freedom and creativity, creating an economy which funds new ideas, which requires education, it requires adequate healthcare, infrastructure. And when we had that, we became the marvel of the world. And then we got rich and began figuring out how to make more money as opposed to producing things.
So I want to go back because I think what you're saying goes along with this. I watched Jimmy Kimmel's return to television, his monologue. Now, I don't follow Jimmy Kimmel. I don't watch late night television whatsoever. And I posted this on Facebook, and people said, well, you can't say this is just a free speech thing. Fine. I'm okay with that. He did have 6.2 million viewers, and maybe that'll drop off, but he did say something very interesting. He talked about Erica Kirk forgiving the shooter of her husband. And he said, basically, that's the model for how we should be. And I think that's true.
I thought that was a very powerful moment. The idea that if we are a Christian nation or a Judeo-Christian nation, revenge is not the solution. And the ability to forgive and to move on is so important. And that's the solution to the strategy of tension. You figure out what we have in common as human beings and work with what we need as in common, as opposed to competition to try and stand on someone else's shoulders to take what we want. So, you know, I don't know about what Jimmy Kimmel said, but I was very moved by.
Well, he was moved actually to tears when he was referencing her words. So I do think it's different for one of these late night guys to say the kinds of things that he was saying at that point. Now, as expected, people in the chat got upset at you for saying Judeo-Christian, because some people say, well, Israel runs the United States and we won't change until Israel stops running the United States.
Let me just say very quickly, there's a difference between the Jewish religion and Zionism. I've written some papers on this extensively, going through how it was the British that took a handful of Jews in the banking community in England and made a deal that they would give them land in return for them being an entry point for the British control over the Middle East. That's what Zionism is. Zionism is a real estate contract, and it's an example of a corruption using the Holocaust as an excuse. And so, you know, I'm Jewish, but I'm not a Zionist. I'm an anti-Zionist through and through. Mm-hmm. And it's funny that people who oppose the theocracy of Iran don't see Israel as a theocracy.
Well, that's very interesting. It's fascinating. I wanted to direct people to the website because it's really something. Let me just put this up on the screen here, where people can learn more about, let's see here, what you have been talking about. This is the main website. You have a whole dossier on what Tulsi is actually uncovering, which is very fascinating. This question of building new development, which seems to be in line with what they're talking about between Russia, China, and these other countries. I'm not sure what this is, but this is probably an American economic recovery policy, which is maybe different than what we're talking about here in the United States today, which I haven't quite figured out what it is that we're talking about officially.
When you mentioned my daily update, what I try to do is
Right.
take 10 to 12 minutes to go through events of the last 24 hours, but put them in a historic context so that people actually can see that we're living in current history, not some kind of abstract bubble in space, and that there's a debt we owe to the past, and as well, if we wish to have a future, there are things we have to do. And that's what I try to present every morning, 5 days a week.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, Harley, thank you very much for joining us here. And there's a lot to be discussed. There's a lot to do. I feel like the frustrations are real that everybody has. I feel those frustrations. It
And
seems
we're
like
just scratching the surface here, because the question of understanding history and economics and the interrelationship, it really requires a lot of work, but it's the only thing that really makes sense in terms of statecraft.
and also going and visiting other countries.
Yes.
I think that has a lot to say with it. On the Whiners, where we've been talking about how we're going to work on creating a dialogue with, in particular, Russia, but not exclusively around, hopefully, wine, but not exclusively wine. Maybe
Georgian wine is very good.
Oh, I know. Actually, I had a lot of good Georgian wine while I was in Russia, and maybe there's somebody we can connect with in Germany to expand that dialogue, because I don't know anybody in Europe institutionally that would be open to this kind of perspective of change.
There are a lot of people that are open to it, but they're scared. There really is a fear in Germany of stepping out of what's acceptable. That's the post-World War II brainwashing.
Yep. Well, look, Vagabond 1983, he's right. People need to start manning the F up, he says. It's true. All right. Harley, is there anything else that you would like to add to our discussion here before we call it an evening?
Well, one thing I always do when I am on these kind of programs is I give out my personal email address. If people want to discuss things with me, ask questions, criticize me, I'm a believer in free speech also. So if people want to write to me, they can reach me at harleysch@gmail.com. It's harleysch@gmail.com, and I'll answer you. It may take a little while, but I will get back to you.
It's a harleysch@gmail.com, right?
That's right.
Right there. That's your email. So great. Well, thanks very much. And next Wednesday, we'll be back with Ask the Inspector with your favorite Scott Ritter, and Jeff Norman will hopefully be back. And then, hold on a second. One before we close, there's a quick question from Tehran. Hassan, friend of ours, he said he wonders if the LaRouche Extensive Development Plan for Palestine can be implemented in Iran. I think he's talking about maybe the Oasis Plan.
The Oasis Plan, sure. Well, the Oasis Plan is necessary for peace in Israel and Palestine because water is a big problem, but it would work anywhere. I mean, Iran has a very interesting connection now with China, and China mediated between Iran and Saudi Arabia. The problem in the Middle East is not money. The problem is putting money into programs that actually transform nature. And that's what he's talking about. And certainly it would work in Iran.
All right. And there you have it. There is a solution. We just have to get the United States to participate, and then probably much of the world would switch their attitude of us and join in too. So thanks, everybody, and thanks to our audience. Thank you very much for coming on late at night, Harley, for this discussion. Have a good evening.
I'm not listening to y'all anymore. I'm not listening to you. He's telling people that, they shouldn't be taking Tylenol unless they have a high fever. Dude, you're not a doctor. No studies have shown that Tylenol is directly causing autism.
Here you go, a study by Harvard. Using acetaminophen during pregnancy may increase children's autism and ADHD risk. And this one from Tylenol themselves. We actually don't recommend using any of our products while pregnant.